Well, good evening. I'm Sid Gisler. I'm the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, and I'm welcoming you here on behalf of the Pulitzer Prize Board and the Columbia Journalism School. I want to thank everyone who has helped us with this program, and especially Sheila Cornell, who's the director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism. She's been my partner in developing the program, so thank you very much, Sheila. Our purpose is quite simple. Every year the Pulitzer Prizes in Journalism are announced with fanfare and the popping of champagne corks. Well, tonight we plan to move beyond the bubbly. Tonight we're going to explore the work itself. Under the banner of Hiding in Plain Sight, 4 Pulitzer-winning journalists will discuss the investigative effort it takes to win a Pulitzer. As you will see, great stories are often waiting to be discovered by an alert reporter who starts asking the right questions and then digs relentlessly. We have an outstanding panel. It includes 2 graduates of Columbia's Journalism School who were once in seats similar to the ones you are occupying tonight. Starting on your far left and moving across the platform, we have our moderator, Walt Bogdanich of the New York Times, widely respected, 3-time winner of Pulitzer Prize, a truly rare feat. His distinguished career spans 60 Minutes, the Wall Street Journal, and now the New York Times, where he is an assistant editor on the investigations desk. His most recent Pulitzer was in 2008. He shared it with in the Investigative Reporting Award for Toxic Pipeline, articles exposing toxic ingredients in Chinese-made products. His previous Pulitzers in 1988 for stories on substandard medical laboratories, and again in 2005 for exposing the cover-up of responsibility for fatal accidents at railway crossings. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin with a master's degree in journalism from Ohio State. He's also a very highly regarded adjunct professor here at the school. Next to Walt is Paige St. John, investigative reporter, the Sarasota Herald-Tribune, who won the Investigative Reporting Prize for revealing how Florida's wobbly property insurance industry puts homeowners at risk. I should say hurricane-dodging homeowners. A graduate of Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, she has been a journalist for more than 3 decades, covering Florida's politics, the environment, and natural disasters, and winning an array of important awards. She joined the Herald-Tribune in 2008 after a variety of newspaper positions. Her notable projects have ranged from exposing Florida's failure to protect fragile beaches to examining the state's notoriously botched electoral system. Although she began as a feature writer, she now specializes in database-driven projects combined with narrative writing and shoe leather reporting. We'll get a taste of that tonight. When not mastering technology, she likes horseback riding and kayaking. Next to Paige, that handsome young man who's smiling is Jeff Gottlieb, and next to him is Ruben Vives of the Los Angeles Times, lead reporters on a team that won the Public Service Prize, which is represented by that gold medallion up there, for stories on astonishing corruption in the little city of Bell, California. The Bell expose won a long string of journalistic honors across the nation. As for Jeff and Ruben, they offer an interesting contrast. Jeff's a 1980 graduate of Columbia's Journalism School. He's a senior writer at the Times, and he's been at the paper for over 14 years. Before that, he had a notable career at other newspapers, including the San Jose Mercury News, where he won a George Polk Award for uncovering questionable spending practices at Stanford University, which led to the resignation of the university's president. He is father of a 3-year-old son, by the way, and he says that little lad helped him get an early start each morning when writing about the Bell scandal. Ruben, next to Jeff, is new to journalism relatively. He got a start as a copy messenger and has worked his way up. As a sign of things to come, he served as an interpreter for Spanish-speaking patients when the Times won the 2005 Pulitzer for Public Service by revealing deadly practices at a major public hospital. He began his reporting career only 3 years ago, writing for the paper's homicide report. Later, he became a general assignment reporter covering a dozen cities in southeast Los Angeles County. Now we can point to those Bell stories that resulted in the arrest of 8 former city officials. And on your far right is Amy Ellis Nutt, an enterprise writer at the Star-Ledger in Newark who won the feature writing prize for her probe into the mysterious death in the Atlantic Ocean of 6 fishermen. She came close to winning a Pulitzer before becoming a finalist in that category in 2009. A graduate of Smith College, Amy has 2 master's degrees, one in philosophy from MIT, the other from Columbia's journalism school in 1995. She's now a member of the adjunct faculty here, and she helps Professor Padway in his RW1 class. In 2004, Amy was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and in April she published her first book, Shadows Bright as Glass, One Man's Remarkable Journey from Brain Trauma to Artistic Triumph. If you look at Amy's work, you'll be struck by her compelling narratives, and you'll also be struck by the exhaustive reporting that underpins beautiful writing. Now, a word about our format. It's going to be interview-style questions with Walt Bogdanich guiding the way as the panelists go through their stories. And we're going to start with the LA Times. We'll devote about 15 minutes in each segment to the prize, and at the end of each segment, we'll turn to the audience for about 10 minutes of questions about that award before moving on to the next segment. So please be thinking of questions from the outset. All 3 segments, once they're finished, we'll have then a general round of questions. Please use the microphone. There's one in this aisle, there's one in the other aisle. Go to the mic nearest to you and ask your questions. We're making a video of the event, and we want to be sure to capture your questions. Oh, and for anyone tweeting tonight, the handle is #CJPulitzer. How hep can anyone get, right? So Walt, take it away.
I once worked for an editor who said, if you can't summarize your investigation in 25 words or less, then you don't know your subject. Well, Jeffrey and Ruben's investigation of government corruption could be summed up on the back of a small business card. How about this? Public officials get fat, figuratively and literally, while sticking it to the poor. And if you doubt the fat part, you'll check some of the pictures out a little later. Rarely does an investigation resonate like theirs did. After the LA Times reported that elected officials of Bell, a poor California city, were not just wetting their beaks at the public trough, they were jumping in head first. Hordes of angry constituents protested, city officials were arrested, government policies were changed. A few highlights. The city manager's annual compensation was $1.5 million. This is the part I like. He got 107 vacation days and 36 sick days a year. Council members received about $100,000 for a part-time job, some of it for attending board meetings that lasted a minute. Wouldn't life be glorious at the Times if our meetings lasted a minute? To pay for this, though, residents had some of the highest property taxes in the county. Police towed their cars, then charged a ransom to get them released. The city cut services, jobs, police. Even more amazing is how these officials managed to pull all this off. They just never expected Ruben and Jeff to come knocking on their door. So, Ruben and Jeff, why did you come knocking on their door? How did this get started? Ruben, why don't you take it first?
Sure. Well, as I began covering the southeast, where these 12 cities are located.
That means southeast LA County.
Right. I was at a council meeting in Maywood, which is next door to Bell, and the council there had agreed to dismantle their police department and lay off all their employees. and they had also approved to contract these services out. And the municipal services were contracted with the city of Bell, and so we wrote a story about that. And while looking into possible malfeasance in Maywood, we learned from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office that they weren't investigating Maywood, but they were inquiring about the salaries in the city of Bell. And we wondered, well, what about those salaries? And that's when we learned that they were nearly $100,000.
Jeff, tell us a little bit about that interview. You did the interview with the district
Right,
attorneys?
well, right.
And you asked one extra question? Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd asked the DA, the head of the Public Integrity Unit, I said, so are you guys investigating Maywood? And he says, no, because other agencies are. And then I'm not sure why I asked it. I said, what about Bell? And he said, as a matter of fact, we're investigating the salaries of the city council members, that they're getting these high salaries. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, you know, $100,000 a year. And I said, well, that's a part-time job, right? And he said, yeah, they should be getting, you know, $6 grand, $8 grand a year. So we wrote, he sent me some documents, we wrote a story on that, which then led me to think this was a similar situation, a story I had written many years ago when I worked at the San Jose Mercury News about the East Palo Alto Sanitary District. And East Palo Alto is a very different city than Palo Alto. It's literally across the railroad tracks, very poor, minority, similar to Bell. And in that story, it turned out board members and staff members were traveling around the country, spending lots of money on fancy hotels, fancy restaurants, those things. And one person, at least one person in that was charged. So then the next day, Ruben and I went to the Bell City Hall. And we wanted to see documents which we're entitled to under the Public Records Act, contracts, minutes of meetings, those sorts of things. So we walk into Bell City Hall, asked to see the city manager, and he won't come and see us, which is pretty odd. It's not very often that a couple of reporters from the LA Times show up in Bell. And the city clerk comes out, we tell her what we want, and she says, fill out this form. So we fill it out, and she says, I figured this is some bureaucratic thing. She says, well, we'll give you the documents in 10 days. Which they're entitled to do under the State Public Records Act. It should have taken her 10 minutes. She should have turned around, handed us some of these documents, and started. Now, every time she's doing something like this, you know, it sort of raises our radar. And then finally, when I tell her if we don't get the documents in 10 days, we're going to sue. And then I ask her for a copy of this document we filled out. She gives me a copy and charges me $1.
Before we move on, let's set the scene a bit. Ruben, you grew up near Bell. Could you give us a feeling for the type of city it was, who lived there?
Sure. It's a 2-square-mile city, about 36,000 residents living in this town. 90% of are Latinos, and more than 50% are foreign-born, meaning that they're probably in the country undocumented. And so this made it sort of an easy place for things like this to happen. You know, not a lot of educated people there. I think more than 60% of the residents there have less than a high school diploma. So, yeah.
So while you were waiting for those 10 days, did you communicate in any way to them that you weren't going away?
Yeah, I was calling the city clerk every day, and when I got her, I'd ask her if the documents were ready, and she would say, I told you 10 days. And I would tell her, well, if we don't get it in 10 days, we're suing, and then we're going to turn around and ask the judge that, to force you guys to pay our legal bills, because that's part of the law. And then meanwhile, we're talking to people in Bell, kind of gadflies, and there was a sense that something was wrong in Bell. No one could quite put their arms around it, but there was something wrong, and people were saying that the city's city manager, who went by the title Chief Administrative Officer, that he made a lot of money. How much? Oh, we'd hear 300, 400 grand.
We're showing this picture up there. I
Right,
think that
right.
says quite a bit. So on the 9th day, something happened.
Right, on the 9th day, I get a phone call from the city clerk who says, we're going to give you the documents tomorrow. And I say, great. And she says, and Mr. Rizzo would like to meet with you two. Great, assuming it's going to be City Hall. And I say, where? And she says, Little Bear Park. So Little Bear Park is a kind of place where I bring my 3-year-old. And so I told Ruben this, and Ruben was more familiar with the park than I am. I think we literally had visions we were going to meet this guy on a park bench. Literally. Okay, so the next day, Ruben and I show up, and we came separately. You want to tell us?
Yeah, Ruben, why don't you tell us what happened?
Sure. So like Jeff said, we arrived separately. I got there a few minutes early because in my mind I thought, well, Jeff had visions of us sitting at a park bench. I had visions of a white van coming up and, kidnapping me, and that'll be the last time you hear from me. So yeah, I got there early, took out my reporter's notebook, just like this one, and began writing down the license plates of all the cars where I was parked, the models, the color, what time it was, and I ripped up the piece of paper, placed it underneath the passenger seat, because I thought, my theory was, okay, I get out of the car, the van pulls up, I'm taken away, who knows what happens to me. But my car's behind, there's evidence there, so they're going to get rid of the car somewhere. And then I thought, well, someone's going to find the car eventually, and then they're going to find somewhere tucked away this little piece of paper with license plates, and it's going to jumpstart the investigation, and that's what I thought, really. Paranoia kicked in at that point.
And then, Jeff, the meeting starts, and
Right.
who's there?
Well, we walk into this meeting, and it turns out we met in a room, in a conference room where the Boy Scouts meet, and there's a fireplace. So Rizzo had brought with him 10 people, clearly trying to intimidate us. A couple attorneys, the mayor, city council member from Maywood, the police chief, city clerk, a bunch of people. And we're all sitting around this table, and Ruben and I are sitting at the front, and the documents are next to us. And somehow they expected us to look through these documents and ask them questions. We're getting the documents, so why bother to look at them there? So we start asking questions. And so eventually I turn to Rizzo and I say, so how much money do you make? And Rizzo says, $700,000, which was such a high figure, I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. So I said, how much? And he says, $700,000. And then Ruben said,
In a kind of loud whisper voice, I said, Jesus Christ. Which I'm sure you all know you're not supposed to do that because you're giving away the story, and the city attorney looks at me and I'm kind of like, oh my God, I just gave away the story. But there's no way they can run. They're in this meeting with us now, and really what they did, they were trying to intimidate us, but what they actually helped do was they put all the eggs in one basket. And so we, one by one, started asking that same question to everyone. We asked the assistant city manager, Angela Spasha, how much do you make? And she said, I don't know. What? How do you not know? You deal with financing, you deal with contracts, you're the number two, and we kept hammering her on this, and eventually, the city manager, Bob Rizzo, intervenes and sort of, gives us her salary, which was $375, I think, or 15 it was. They sort of gave us false figures at that time when we were interviewing them.
And Jeff, as part of your investigation, you also interviewed a minister who had recently become a city councilman?
Right.
And what did he tell you?
Right, well, Luis Artiga, we had, he was at this meeting, and as was the mayor, Oscar Hernandez, and so I asked them if they made more than $100,000 salary, which they were getting from the city, in their civilian lives. And Oscar Hernandez, the mayor who owns a little bodega, he smiled and said, oh, yes. And we didn't think he was telling the truth. And then we asked Luis Artiga that question, and he says when he was appointed, he didn't know how much he was going to be getting. And I said, well, what did you think when you got that first paycheck? And he said, I thought it was a gift from God.
And your comment?
And my comment, I was thinking to myself, was no, the gift from God is your quote, because that's going in the story.
Well, exorbitant compensation viewed in isolation might provoke little more than a shrug. What made your findings so explosive here in Bell?
Well, I think there were several things. I mean, that was just the first of what, close to 200 stories that the paper
Right.
did?
200 stories.
Right. And you have a poor city, one of the poorest cities in LA County with Rizzo being paid probably pretty close to the highest of any city manager in the United States, and being utterly unrepentant about it. Utterly unrepentant. One of his quotes was, if that's the number of people choke on, maybe I'm in the wrong business. I could go into private business and make that money. But it's not illegal to make too much money. And that first story actually quoted someone as saying that. But ultimately, we uncovered, a series of law breaking, and Rizzo turned out was just turning in contracts that he'd written himself. City council never approved, but it was a long list of things that people were eventually charged with.
After that meeting at Little Bear Park, you write the story. What's the reaction?
All hell broke loose is the only way to describe it. The meeting was on a Friday. The story came out in Wednesday evening on the website, Thursday in the newspaper. And both of us were inundated with emails. And Ruben keeps his...
My BlackBerry's on vibrate, so, when it hit online Wednesday night, it was quiet. The phone was dead. But Thursday morning around 5 a.m. when the print edition hit the streets, it was just buzzing and buzzing with emails of just public outrage. People from, oh, come down to my town. It's just worse than Bell, trust me. Come down and...
These are people from Denver,
right.
People from Long Island.
Some little town you never heard of, and I'm like, I can't help you, I'm sorry.
Covering a poor suburban city is, to be honest, not the sexiest, most prestigious beat at the newspaper, and yet you won a Pulitzer. There has to be a lesson in this somewhere. What is it?
Well, I think it's the lessons are follow your instincts. A story's a story. And ultimately, if as I'm sure you guys have heard, because I certainly heard it when I was here, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. This is a classic kind of thing we do as journalists. You look for good stories. It's wrongdoing. It's just the classic kind of stuff that we should be doing as journalists.
What lessons can we draw from your experience in investigating Bell?
I think it shows the importance of journalism. It's a prime example of what goes wrong when the checks and balances fall apart. We weren't necessarily watching that city for a very long time. The state should have caught some of these things. The county should have caught some of these things. The auditing firm that was auditing the books for the city of Bell should have caught some of these things, and no one did. And here you have these residents who are angry, and they're trying to inform someone that's come to my town. It's pretty bad, and everyone's sort of kind of shrugging because they're thinking we hear this all the time, but. We listened and we followed through, and so as a reporter, I think, like Jeff said, just follow your instinct, and that's exactly what I did, and that's essentially what we all did.
But one of the things I think it also demonstrated, in particular in this case, was the importance of newspapers. Because when we came in and said, if you don't give us this stuff, we'll sue you, we were serious, and they knew we were serious. There had been someone who had come in Bell, a fellow who's a paramedic who lives in Bell, who had filed a public records request a couple years earlier, had gotten a fake document, which showed that Rizzo only made $185,000 a year. City council members had made around $8,000 a year. you know, and it's difficult. Someone like that isn't going to turn around and get a lawyer and pay for it out of his own money to sue. So I think it just shows how important it is for something like a newspaper, I mean, as opposed to, you know, using the cliche, the blogger sitting in his underwear writing. I mean, it's too easy to push those people away. It's you know, important institutions that have support that can do these kinds of things.
Quick question and final question. And it almost seems silly to ask it, but is there anything you would have done differently? Because it sounds like you were dealt 5 aces here.
You know, I would have taped that conversation, that original. I mean, what turned out, here Ruben and I walk into this meeting with these guys, you know, we're not expecting, what turned out to sort of be this historic moment. I mean, I would have taped that. I think there are a couple times I would have slowed down. I mean, we were, and I think Ruben and I have talked about that, and I think he agrees with me.
The investigation was fast-paced. It was like every day, you know, dig into something, follow it through, write it, and it was really fast-paced. And at times, we felt like we may have missed some stuff, but I think in the end, looking back, did we miss anything crucial? I don't think so. Clearly, we didn't. I mean, look at the picture above.
So if there are any relatives of Rizzo in the audience and want to ask them questions, or just, you know, journalists who want to know more about the investigation, here's your opportunity. There are 2 microphones. You might say who you are and fire away.
Hi, I'm David Evans, Bloomberg News. I'm a guest here tonight at Paige. I live in LA, and I'm curious, one of the things that struck me after you guys did this amazing reporting was there have been tremendous cutbacks at the LA Times, and I wonder if part of the reason that this had gone on for so long might have been the fact that there wasn't the local reporter covering that section of town who would have asked these sorts of questions just as part of their routine coverage of the city.
I mean, interesting enough, we had a bureau office there in nearby city, Huntington Park, and it's close to Bell. And we had about 4 reporters there at one point, and 4 went, we had to shut down the bureau, and then, you know, those reporters left, and then it was, no one was really watching that area until I came along in August of 2009, and it was just me and 12 cities. You know, how do you cover that? Well, you just, you know, what I decided to do was go from city to city and find a story and report it that way, and then talk to residents and hear out what their issues were, and do my best to sort of just hone in on those issues, centralize and focus on the problems for each of those cities. Although initially I was just writing about, you know, feature stories, but eventually I landed in Maywood, and things there were just really bad that down the road, Jeff and I would you know, I've said this before, we go down the yellow brick road to meet the wizard. So, but yeah, essentially that added to it, I think.
But also, there was an LA Times reporter a few years before us who actually asked for Rizzo's salary and was given a fake document too. So.
Hi, my name is Matt Drange. I'm a student in the Stabile Center here. I just had a question about actually not so much Bell, but if you guys could talk about how your reporting led to Washington State and his whole, you know, horse ranch and the horse that was named Spend Money, and maybe the kind of break that led you guys out of Bell and into the other place.
I think we had another reporter who did that story. So I don't know how we were able to. I mean, you go through property records and you find out, oh, he has a ranch up there. I'm not too sure. How do we?
Actually, I think the way that came out is what we learned is, okay, that powwow that we described, that meeting, was on a Friday. And actually, after that meeting, right, I think that's how we found out, Rizzo, councilman, the mayor, some other people, they went up to Rizzo's horse ranch in Washington State. I think that's how we found out, and that led to the story about this horse ranch.
What we learned, essentially, rumors in Bell were always somewhat true. And what's your story about if Bob Rizzo was?
Yeah, it became so bizarre at times after reporting this. You know, one of the things as a reporter that happens is you always hear from people, you know, they're giving you tips, and you have to decide what to spend your time on, what's going to be fruitful, what's, the guy talking about the TV sending him messages through his teeth. But it got to a point where if someone had come to us and said, listen, I have proof that Bob Rizzo is an alien sent from Saturn to loot the city of Bell, we would have had to check it out.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Carla Bleicher, and I'm also a student here in the newspaper concentration. I was wondering if you could talk about this one council member that made significantly less than everyone else. I thought that was pretty interesting, and I was wondering what kind of source he was, being that he was kind of this disgruntled employee, if you will, and those are usually pretty good.
I think this particular council member was making about $673 a month compared to his colleagues who were making, $15,000, $18,000, whatever it was. And eventually he thought, I thought everyone was making what I was making. That's why he ended up not realizing, oh my God, they're making this much money. But it ended up being a good thing for him. He wasn't in handcuffs with the rest of these guys. We still have questions about that, whether he would have got that salary at some point, because he was appointed. And the way you get that salary is you have to be elected. So he was up for, the next year he would have been up for re-election. So.
And I actually, when we found out that he was not making the $100,000, I called up the DA and I said, you know about this, that he's, only not making $100,000? And he said, no, if I were him, I'd be pissed.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm also a Stabile student here at the school. My question is, you mentioned that auditors should have caught these high salaries somewhere earlier in the process, but what would the impact have been if Bell's local paper didn't fold 90 years ago? If there was a local reporter on the scene who covered, say, city council meetings.
Right. Well, I necessarily wasn't going to the Bell meetings. I was going to the Maywood Council, and there had been this problem with this town where they were about to lose their insurance. They were facing a deficit of $450,000, and what they were thinking of doing was dismantling the police department and merging. Not dismantling, but merging their police department with the city of Bell and creating this regional police law enforcement. And a lot of the officers didn't like it. Eventually, Maywood did what they did, and that's what led us to go into Bell. But yeah, had I not been going to the Bell meetings, I'm sure we probably wouldn't have not heard about this.
Okay, one more question. I guess we're over on that side now. Yes.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a student here, broadcast concentration. I actually was in LA. I read your story when it first came out on the front page. I remember that huge graphic that showed the $800,000 amount. And I think the story not only speaks to public corruption, but also public business being done out of the public view. And I actually worked in city government for the city of LA when the story came out. I felt like a lot of public officials were more wary after your story. Did you feel, working with other officials on other stories, that people maybe were more forthcoming or less forthcoming afterwards?
God, I don't know if people were more or less forthcoming. I think one of the results of the story was that every editor of papers all around the country immediately sent their city hall reporter out there and said, find out how much city officials are making. That clearly happened. And the state controller has put on his website in California the salaries of basically every public employee in the state, of every city council and special district, and not just the elected officials, but the workers. So that is clearly happening. There's more transparency. Are they more forthcoming?
I think it's mixed. Jeff and I, we've been dealing with another city there, the city of Cudahy, also a really tiny town, and the officials there were reluctant to speak to us, and so we're like, well.
They were more than reluctant. They won't.
Yeah, they won't talk to us. They literally sometimes at one point running away from us. But, they're afraid because they're like, the city attorneys telling us they're just afraid, they think that you guys are, what happened in Bell and you're going to come in and that's what you're looking for. But I think I've run into other cities where they're very forthcoming, you know, their city clerk is not like the one in Bell. They're giving you documents right away, and so it's a mixed reaction, what I've seen so far, personally, myself.
Those of you who have additional questions, hold on to them until the general Q&A, but we're going to move on. One of the big challenges in any lengthy investigative project is knowing how to organize massive amounts of information so that when the time comes to finally write, you don't find yourself sitting in front of a towering pile of undecipherable notes, coffee-stained documents, random emails, pictures, and other mysterious artifacts, all more suitable for a nesting mouse than for writing a story. Well, there are few reporters more skilled than Amy Ellis Nutt at collecting and managing thousands of bits of seemingly disparate facts and then weaving them into a seamless, dramatic narrative. With every tick of the clock, Amy draws the reader deeper and deeper into the mystery of how and why 6 scallop fishermen died 66 miles off the coast of New Jersey. In her masterful work, The Wreck of the Lady Mary, Amy taught the U.S. Coast Guard the correct way how to do an investigation. In doing so, she stirred reader outrage. She certainly stirred mine, building a strong case that a much larger container ship rammed the small fishing boat and then fled the scene, leaving 6 people to die. Amy, the death of the fisherman had already been reported. What compelled you to take a closer look?
Well, there were probably a number of things. It was a story that I was following, that we were reporting, you know, in the back of our paper and periodically on our website, nj.com. The thing that caught my interest, first of all, was that all the theories that were being floated about how it went down. Its gear was caught, it was the weather, the dredge, malfunctioned, it was an unseaworthy ship, and it was amazing how many theories there were. And of course, when the theory of the possibility of it being a collision with a massive container ship piqued my interest, I also realized that, you know, the Coast Guard is investigating something, and there's a slight conflict of interest. The Coast Guard is also obviously responsible and does, you know, heroic things in terms of rescue, but they're responsible for, tracking signals and getting someone out there in distress. So I also realized it was, that it was sometimes worked against their own interest. And then I started to look into the background of the people that were leading the investigation and realized that how scant the background was in terms of their ability to have done investigations into collisions. The commander had done no investigations where there had been loss of life or where there had been collisions. And, when you first start talking to people, one of the first experts said, I asked, why are these so many, more and more you look into what happens, when people are lost at sea, especially commercial fishermen, and no one knows, what happened to them. And I said, why do these things remain mysteries? And he said, it's the best line in the whole series, and it's not mine. There are no skid marks on the ocean. And I also realized, if 6 people had been killed in a car accident, it would have been front page, and it would have been front page for days. And this was a back of the newspaper story, and it just didn't seem right.
There was another bit of evidence that you looked at that suggested that a container ship perhaps had rammed the Lady Mary. Something about where the scallop beds were and where the shipping lane was. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah, you have to become an expert in so many different things when you work on a project like this, including, navigation, which I'm very backwards on anyway. And one of them is reading charts and reading graphs. And I discovered that the scallop ground that is the richest scallop ground on the East Coast that most of the Jersey scallopers go to, and even the Massachusetts scallopers, is right smack in the middle of one of the busiest shipping lanes certainly in the United States. And I started investigating more about what the regulations at sea are in terms of rights of way and things like that. And when I realized or discovered in my research that that ships are required to slow down for endangered whales, but not for commercial fishermen, I decided that there's something seriously wrong with that. I'm a big believer in saving endangered whales, but it seems to me that fishermen are endangered too right now.
The boats are much smaller, the fishing boats, than the container ships.
Just a tad.
Just a tad. 6 of the 7 fishermen died. The survivor didn't see what happened. He was asleep below the deck. How were you able to reconstruct this accident and what happened?
Well, obviously, Jose was invaluable. He also didn't speak much English, so we had to do that all through interpreters. What I did have were, through a couple of our sources and also through one of the lawyers working for Captain Fuzzy, whose sons died on the Lady Mary, documents indicating, vessel tracking, where the Lady Mary was, where other boats were at the time. So I developed an elaborate timeline that involved not just what was happening to the Lady Mary, but what was happening with other ships in the area and where they were, what was going on land with the families, what was going on at the Coast Guard, where was the buoy that establishes, that was off floating, that establishes the weather conditions. So a lot of people didn't even know what the weather was like out there. So it was an enormous, minute by minute outline of what was going on in many different places.
Besides helping you build a narrative, did the chronology help you in other ways? For instance, were there certain clues or certain truths that emerged as you put together that chronology?
Yeah, probably one of the biggest ones was, and I had to call the Delaware River Pilots Association to find out what time, the suspect container ship in this, called the Cap Beatrice, what time the Cap Beatrice actually docked. Should have been about 3.5 hours away, and she didn't end up docking in Port of Philadelphia for another, dozen hours. And that was something when I was trying to establish the timeline of what happened afterwards and where people went and where ships went. That was a huge question mark. Why does it take a ship that it's only 3.5 hours away, 12 hours to get there? The only thing the Coast Guard had in their hearings was that the vessel identification system locating where the Cap Beatrice was turned off, either accidentally or on purpose, for about 6 hours. So they didn't know. But I knew what time the ship had docked, and it didn't make any sense. There was a huge amount of time that was missing.
Early in the telling of your story, you recounted how one of the crew members on the fishing boat had spotted an 8-foot plank of wood and had brought it on board for the purpose of trying to repair a fishing bin. That plank played a major role in your story, as we learned later on. How did you come across that little bit of information? Tell us the significance of it.
If you can have a Moby Dick moment, that was it when he told me this. It's a matter of when you interview someone who's obviously key to a story, you don't just interview them once about what happened. You ask the same questions over and over. You keep coming back. The poor guy, I would go back a few days later and then a few days later, and I would ask him to retell me the whole story. But I would ask him to start the story in a different place. Okay, tell me about what you were doing when you left. Tell me about what you were doing, right before you went to sleep on board the boat. tell me about what happened right after you woke up. And I learned that fact about that piece of timber that he had brought on board on one of our last conversations. I had had him back up and tell me about what he was doing, beforehand, when he got down to the dock before the boat left. So it's really, it taught me how important it is just to keep asking the same questions, because you get more information, but to ask it slightly different, and if it's about a sequence of events, to ask the person to relate the events, but starting at a different point, because different things, will come up.
And tell us why that board was important.
Oh, that was the board, so he puts this board on, right before he gets on board the Lady Mary, because he's going to make some repairs to the fish hold underneath, and he lays it down right next to the place where the life raft on the bow of the ship. And it was reported that he was clinging to a piece of wood. Well, that piece of wood was what floated out to him when he had to, the ship was going down, the boat was going down, and he had to swim away from it. And within minutes, this piece of timber floated out to him. And he told me when he was rescued by the Coast Guard, he didn't want to let it go. He was trying to take it with him as the Coast Guard was trying to lift him up into the helicopter, because it saved his life, obviously.
Interview people and keep interviewing them and keep interviewing them. That's a great lesson, Amy. We often talk about immersing ourselves in a story. You did that and more by actually going out on a scallop boat. Why? Were you that fond of scallops? What did you learn?
I love scallops. You become an expert in so many things. I mean, I am a member of the International Maritime Organization still, and, I read, Scallops Today magazine and, Vessel Tracking Monthly. It's fabulous reading. But I also needed to know, I spent a lot of time down in the docks interviewing fishermen, but I knew, and I worked with, I want to say this, I worked with an amazing colleague, Andre Malik, who did the graphics, the photographs, and the video. And if you haven't seen his 23-minute video, go to nj.com and put in the search Lady Mary and watch his video. It's just masterful. But we both agreed that, neither of us had been involved in the commercial fishing industry. Neither of us fished. He did a little kayaking, like Paige, and that was about it. But I knew that I needed to go out to see what it was like. And it didn't just inform the story in terms of color, it was critical what I learned being out there. A lot of people, when they heard the story that I was working on and the suspicions that we were having that this was possibly a high seas hit and run, they would say, well, the survivor, how could he not have seen, it's a huge container ship, massively, larger than a fishing boat. And it's true, it seems kind of curious. Also, there were reports, it was, 10 to 12 foot waves, so it could have easily been swamped. Going out on a scallop boat and spending 13 hours, and believe me, it was a hideous experience because I've never been so seasick in my life. But what I realized were several things. First of all, 10 to 12 foot seas doesn't bother these guys at all. Doesn't bother the boat, You're going like this, and the waves, and the water is flying, and it doesn't even bother them. They're working. So one thing I realized, it's not a big deal for most fishing vessels, commercial fishing vessels, to be in those kinds of seas. The other thing is on the back of a ship, you do most of it at night, the lights are really, really bright. It's like being on a stage. So you can't see past the gunnels at all. The other thing I realized was when we were out there, we also saw a container ship, going only a quarter of a mile away, and it's very hard to see. There are minimal amounts of lights, running lights, and if it's coming towards you, towards the back of a boat, towards the stern, the engine and the sound really coming from a container ship is hundreds of feet back from the bow. So if it's coming up from behind, and there's, the noise on a commercial fishing dredge with the winches, the electronic winches, and the metal clashing, it was really easy to see how how they were working and could easily not have seen this ship coming up behind them.
Accepting the fact that no two investigations are alike and that few of you out there will have the opportunity to investigate death on the high seas, are there nonetheless a few universal reporting lessons that you can share from your prize-winning report?
Well, one thing, Dramamine doesn't help if you're going out, if you're going 65 miles out. You know, and I've mentioned this already, is becoming an expert on things. This was such a complicated case, and because there were theories out there and nothing had been really substantiated, I had to learn what is the difference between a 406 megahertz distress signal and a 121.5. Turns out, big difference. You know, I had to learn and talk to people about how do you identify fractures in a rudder. You know, from how do you differentiate between a stress fracture and a fracture from impact? You know, how much do scallops weigh? How hard is it to do? How do you do it on a ship? Where are you when you're doing it? You know, what is the lifting capacity of a winch, of a dredge? You know, so it's all of this stuff I've now forgotten, by the way. But at the time, I could tell you, I could go on and on about, navigation, distress signals, EPIRBs, had to learn about satellites, the NOAA satellites, SARSAT, the history of navigation, the difference between the lights on a mast and what they mean. So, and if I hadn't become a sort of, mini expert on these things, there's no way I could have written this story and written it with the depth that I did. So.
Questions from the audience?
I'm Chitra. You mentioned it was a tiny story at the back of the newspaper that was going unnoticed. So how did you convince your editor that this is worth pursuing in more depth?
I played up the theory that I think that the idea that it might have been a high seas hit and run was very provocative. Cape May, where the ship was, is not in our, it's hard to find the Star Ledger down there. It's about 2.5 hours from Newark. But I kept bombarding them with facts. I looked into how many of these collisions happen around the world, and it's incredible. Hundreds and hundreds of people are lost, and these happen all over the world, but we never hear about them there. I also convinced them that no one in this country had ever been prosecuted and for killing a fisherman in a collision, even though it had happened dozens and dozens of times. And finally, I convinced them by saying, you talk about being able to summarize a story. I said, this is the perfect storm, but with a bad guy.
Please.
Hi, I'm Nat. I'm a MS Stabile student here as well. And I just want to ask, could you have done the story without those 2 internal documents from the inside Coast Guard sources? And how would your story have changed without those?
Well, it would have been really hard. And what would have changed, I'll answer the first part, the second part, is I don't think we could have shown the preponderance of evidence for a collision. The lawyer representing Fuzzy also provided us with a number of exhibits from the testimony and the hearings. I FOIA'd everything from the NTSB and the Coast Guard, but they were able to say it was an ongoing investigation. In fact, the final report has not yet been released. I talked to someone in the Coast Guard just last week, and they said maybe early next year. So that was absolutely invaluable. Yeah.
Next question. Yes.
Hi. I'm Holly. I am a graduate from a couple years ago and currently work as a journalist here in New York. I'm curious for you, Amy, and also Ruben and Jeff, when you're doing these big stories, and Amy, this is really for you, are you continuing to write a beat, or are you covering other things, and how do you divide your time, and at what point is this the focus of your workday?
I'm very lucky, despite all the cutbacks in our paper and We've lost nearly half of our reporters. I was given a lot of leeway, especially because it involved a lot of travel down to Cape May. So essentially for 7 or 8 months, I was working on this solo. However, I was also, I belong to the rewrite people, so I would have to do that, and if there was breaking news. But by and large, I didn't have a beat anyway. I'm just sort of enterprise, general assignment. So I was very lucky to be able to devote my time to it. And so it was all I was doing. I was living and breathing it, and there was the taste of salt water in my mouth at all times. I mean, it's what it felt like.
We'll let Jeff and Ruben answer that question in the general Q&A later. Next question for Amy.
I'm Rin. I'm a student at the Stabile Center. I was curious if there was anything in that period of time with the Cat Beatrice that you heard but you weren't able to substantiate and didn't put into the story, and also how you were able to get onto the ship the one time that you were able to get on there.
Yeah, that's a good. I'll answer that first. At the very beginning, I made it. I needed to get on. I needed to get on the ship. And luckily, about every few months, it's in port in Philadelphia. In fact, I checked before I came, and at 2:58 Eastern Time today, it was Cat Beatrice was in port in Melbourne, Australia. So it's like I'm still following it. I can't, can't give it up. But I called them and I said, this is the very beginning of the story, and I said to the representatives of the shipping, not the owners of the boat, but the people that basically rent the boat, that I was looking into a story about the busy shipping lanes and the conflicts with scallopers, and that I really wanted specifically to get aboard the Cat Beatrice. I knew it was coming into port, and would I be able to do that? And I knew I needed to set it up so that I would get onto that ship. And it was remarkable experience. And were there things that I couldn't use and substantiate? Yeah, it was fascinating talking to the master of the ship. It was not Vassal Stenderchuk, who was the captain at the time of the Cat Beatrice in 2009. But he gave me a lot of insight. He was one who gave me the name of the captain, and into why ships I asked him a number of times, what he thought about it, and he evaded, but hinted at things, but gave me a lot of insight into what goes on these ships and what might have happened, but, I couldn't confirm any of that.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Cesar. I'm a recent alum. Amy, I'm just curious, as you were doing your reporting, you clearly had a hypothesis in mind that you were going with. Did you have a negative hypothesis as well, or something to keep yourself in check so that you sort of kept your eyes open for facts that might disprove?
Yeah, no, it was really important to be open to all theories. So I had different piles, I had, the dredge got caught on the bottom theory. I had it was swamped theory. It was structural problems with the boat. So they all had to be considered. It was very important to keep an open mind about that. But the more people I talked to, the more experts I talked to, everything seemed to point in that direction. And it was problems with the other theories that kept sending us back to the collision theory.
Last question.
Hi, my name is Jasmine. I'm also in the Stabile program. The moment in your piece that really struck me was the moment where, I guess her name was Karina, was viewing the body of her partner that had passed away on the boat. Can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to really develop a trust amongst the family members of those that passed away? Because that really struck to me as a really intimate moment, and I was just wondering how you got her to open up.
They're all remarkable people. I think because I approached them and I said, I want to tell the story of, your loved ones who were lost, your husbands, your boyfriends, because those stories are never told. They just aren't. They're really hard to find. and they were very open, and, the children are jumping around, and the things that came out of the mouths of babes and talking about, their father were heart-wrenching. What was hard was to keep composure, actually. But I found almost everyone very open and receptive. It was only the wife of, she spoke very little English, who it was too difficult for her to talk. She just couldn't go there. But more often than not, I tell people want to talk, people want to tell you, especially about someone that they loved and that they lost, and who they were. I was very fortunate in that regard.
Let me close with one final question. We all hope that some justice, flows from our work, and at the end of the day, there's a happy ending in the sense that, the guilty are apprehended or pay the price in whatever form that is appropriate. That didn't happen in this case. How do you feel about that?
Oh, it's very hard. It's very hard. One of my regrets is that the newspaper was thinking about sending me over to Germany to confront. They wouldn't talk on the phone. I wanted to have that opportunity. It's very difficult to think, because I know from talking to so many commercial fishermen and just seeing the stories that it happens, internationally, but it happens all the time. I hear the stories from these guys who say, yeah, that ship went right by us and, never even slowed down, and I was, on the radio trying to get them, and they don't care. And, even from the perspective of the captain of the Cap Beatrice, who said, oh, the shipping companies, they don't care. It's just, they pay their insurance, or they'll pay off someone, and, it's neither here nor there for them. And that's still remarkably frustrating, but.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the final story. A long time ago, when I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, I set out to find an area of coverage that might yield a lot of low-hanging fruit. Eventually, I found myself wandering around in the world of insurance. Not many reporters ventured into that orchard, let me tell you. The beat was widely perceived to be boring, complicated, unlikely to produce many front-page stories. They were wrong. The most persuasive evidence of that is Paige St. John's dogged investigation of Florida's property insurers. Paige had the courage and foresight to break away from the reporting pack, to tackle a complex, opaque industry that used its own unique language, much as Amy was talking about in the seafaring world. Where others feared to tread, Paige went in with guns blazing. Florida homeowners, she discovered, did not realize that the insurance companies that they thought would protect them from financial disaster were in fact often a financial disaster themselves. Much of investigative reporting is looking at a set of facts and asking yourself, what's wrong with this picture? Here's the picture that Paige described in her first article. Quote, over the past year, without having to weather a single hurricane, Florida led the nation with a half-dozen property insurance failures. Paige, why don't you tell us what's wrong with that picture?
And you make insurance sound like broccoli. And it really is after hearing these amazing stories. But it's really it's a world of pirates and ne'er-do-wells and every aspect of fear and greed that drives every other great story or journalism. So, which I found eventually as I dug my way into this. The picture that was wrong for me at the outset was a subtle one, and I'm glad you approach it this way, Walt, because my favorite class in journalism school was photography, and that taught me to look and to observe, and that's that's the skill I think that I brought to this subject. We had 4 years after 8 hurricanes in the state, property insurance rates were still escalating. Companies were going bankrupt and failing, and the legislature and governor could not find a fix other than to continue to allow rates to go higher and higher. And I'd come into the habit of following our governor, Jeb Bush at the time, kind of ambush interviews. I'd look at his schedule to see when he might be walking from point A to point B, where there would be no other journalists around, and I'd just show up and walk with him and just start prattling off with questions, and he had to answer them. And we, more and more on these ambush interviews, wound up talking about the property insurance problem in the state, because it became evident that home sales were not going through. Banks, even before the subprime crisis had started to lay itself out, Florida housing market in Florida was tanking, and it was because property insurance rates were so high that people couldn't qualify for mortgages. People couldn't find insurance. They couldn't find a company to cover them. State Farm was leaving the state. Allstate was leaving, and Nationwide. And these companies that nobody had ever heard of before were popping up like mushrooms in a cow field overnight. So Jeb Bush, in about the 4th time that I had asked him what's going on and what are you doing about it, turned to me in a back hallway in between the Senate hearing and the secret entrance to the governor's office, and he always has this gaggle of aides around him, and yet the guy's like 15 feet tall. He's huge, and he turned, instead of looking at me, he turned to the wall, and then he started banging his head against it. And he muttered something about what do you do when they don't want it. He meant they being the insurance companies and it being risk, and it was like, he's a true Bush free market guy. No matter how much money he let them have, no matter how deregulated he let the industry grow, they were still running, screaming from Florida with their hair on fire. And it was so maddening to him that he started, and later I found out by that point, he was secretly texting Arnold Schwarzenegger in California and other Republican governors saying, let's create our own risk pool for catastrophes. And I didn't find that out for 2 or 3 more years later. He was looking for a socialism kind of fix, a Mr. Free Market. And that was the crossroads for me as a reporter. The brightest guy I knew couldn't fix this problem and couldn't find a solution to it. So I began thinking about the whole crisis, legislative hearings, and all of the fixes that went on for the next few years in a different way than the other reporters in the state who were looking at just covering it on a daily he said, she said basis. Instead, I started running numbers. The numbers didn't add up. Everything I looked at, everything I touched was different than what the rhetoric that had been passed off as truth, not just for the few years past the hurricanes, but for like the decade since Hurricane Andrew came through Miami, and it just kept going from there. It kept getting more untrue and more untrue. So.
At some point, the prospect of investigating such a complicated industry surely gave you pause.
Oh.
Did you take us through your mental process? Am I going to get involved in something like this? It might be 10 years before I come out the rabbit hole.
First of all, I hate insurance. I was a feature writer. I want to do what Amy does. And so I looked for ways to try to. I tried to get to the people in the story and the human nature. And I'm a geek. I do databases, and I wrote computer codes, and I scooped up. I filled several hard drives with many gigabytes of databases to do the project, but I looked for the people who were driving it, and that helped me get through this. Once I learned the language, and I literally would take audio tapes of quarterly earnings calls with financial analysts and just listen to them in the car as I drove someplace for 5 hours. It's like Rosetta Stone, and you get past this
It must have been fun to be around.
It's a real party killer. You go to cocktail parties and they say, "What are you doing?" And I would start talking in this language, but you train your ear, and then all of a sudden you would hear the most amazing things. And these guys were literally confessing to greed in their own language. And so in the end, the hardest part of the project was translating that back into English. But there would be some amazing quotes that really were in English, like one of them from the CEO of a company that made hundreds of millions of dollars off of the disaster in Florida, was never underestimate the power of fear and greed. He was telling stock analysts this about how much money he was going to make out of the crisis
Sounds
in
like
Florida.
Gordon Gekko.
It was, I rented that. I had to get into the mindset of Wall Street because that's who was driving this industry. We thought this was going to be a 3-month project, and it turned into a 3-year project. And it went places we never imagined it would go. We just knew that the crisis was horrible. It was getting worse. Nobody was looking at it. And we were going to do the Woodward and Bernstein thing of just follow the dollar and see where it went.
That was my next question.
yeah,
Investigative reporters are told to follow the money. You
Yes.
followed the insurance dollar.
Yes.
Where did it take you?
And it essentially it took me all over the world, and I went there. Despite the bean counters, I wound up in Monte Carlo. I wound up in Bermuda.
Nice.
And in a word to anyone in a newsroom, it is cheaper to go to Monte Carlo than to send a reporter to the Republican National Convention or the DNC. So go find the fresh stories where the other reporters are not. Because you come back with so much that's more. But eventually, it came back into our own backyard because it was, or the U.S., because it was to satisfy, in fact, they were trying to match the profits of the subprime, vehicles through reinsurance, through these deals on, and reinsurance is nothing but a casino. It's, in the end, nothing more elaborate than gambling and betting on human disaster and all the bad things that could happen in the world. And so it wound up back in New York, essentially.
Like most outstanding investigative projects, you built your case against the industry in part, in large measure, with public records.
Yeah.
I'm sure when you started, you had no idea these records existed. How did you know what to look for?
We have two skills that all journalists, I think, have. One is curiosity, intelligent curiosity, and the other is the ability to do creative, critical thinking. And so I have an approach that I've heard from many of the greats in the room, yourself and Jim Steele, talk about, first of all, imagine that it's out there. What you need to know is out there someplace in some form. You don't know what the document will be or what who has that piece of paper. But if you can visualize that it's out there, that will help you find who might have it. I used human sources and asked them what to look for and where to go. They led me to records. I used those records to find other human sources. I tried to go deeper every time I did that ping pong, match. And I got to the point where I was asking for things that even people in the industry didn't know existed and creating databases that they didn't know were possible. And
10 years from now, as you look back on your investigation, other than winning the Pulitzer, what will you remember most about it? What will stick with you?
That's an interesting question. Waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, thinking, "Oh my God," I just, and I'm into another project like this. I told my editor on the phone this morning that I'm beginning to feel intimidated by my project, so we know it's a good one. The fear that this is too big and this is more than you can do, that's a big motivator for me, just like it is for this rich CEO of this reinsurance company, that trying to do something bigger than I thought I could do.
What would you have done differently?
Oh, and we've talked about this one a lot, in part because we're a small paper and this took my dedicated resources for a long time. We've come up with two answers or two possible theories, and neither one really holds water. I don't think we would do a thing differently. But the first thought was that my editor let me go solo for the first year while he was doing, because he was also an investigative reporter and doing his own project, which was a finalist the year prior for the Pulitzer on mortgage fraud in the state. so that I was leaderless that first year and went places I didn't, he probably wouldn't have let me go, and spent time digging up stuff he probably wouldn't have, in the interest of time, tried to make me more efficient. But being self-driven, I think, let me get the full immersion, that kind of gonzo journalism that you need to do to get in deep to something like this. The second, it was also toward efficiency. I look back at the mess. I mean, I literally filled a room with all of the records, not counting the electronic stuff I had, and notes, volumes and volumes of transcribed notes. I transcribed everything, and it took so long to go back through all those notes. I thought I should be more efficient at that, but I think not, and I've discussed this with you, Walt, because when you reread those notes 3 and 4 and 5 times, new stuff comes up every time. And you start linking A and B together, and you come up with, X, Y, and Z all of a sudden, and you get conclusions you didn't even know you had in your own material.
You also put together, you in your paper put together a database for your readers to use. Why don't you show us a little bit about how it works and why they found it so valuable?
The geek in me is pretty excited about this, but I think this is a big part of where we're going in making stories relevant and to readers, and giving them, I mean, we have power to make things help the reader understand how something that is abstract affects their own lives in ways we didn't have before. So we created a website, and it's a standard website. It's got all of the stories that ran in the project, and it took us a whole year to get the project out. But let me scroll down to the first one that we created. We took a standard. The core concept here was, how do I get everything that's in my notes and my databases to the reader, and how do I make it relevant to the reader? So we're not just reading about, oh, here's the top 10 list of the bad insurance companies. You instantly want to know as a reader, well, what about my company? And 1 out of 3 Floridians in our finding were insured by a high-risk insurance company that probably could not pay for a hurricane, let alone a house fire. And so, yes, your first question is going to be, what about my company? So we created a database that's pretty simple, a ranking system that let you, call up a company. We came up with like Siskel and Ebert, little 5-star rating system. So I took this very complex schematic that I had worked with insurance experts on devising. We only used one tool that regulators use, and we created 4 more of our own to judge the risk of an insurance company, and then created a way that people could look up their company, could sort through these, even if they didn't want to do one company and they just want to know what how they all look, could sort them and get a feel for where they fall in the spectrum. And you see how many companies we have in the red zone here. And this appeared in February and was just like a wildfire through the state. We had insurance agents statewide loading this up, and we made an app you could use your iPhone if you wanted to go to Walmart and look up your insurance company. There you go. They began using it with their customers statewide. So we bridged our readership area, which was really just a 2-county, 1-county area, and had statewide impact. We have a lot of people in Florida who live the other half of the year in New York and other states, and they started using this too. So it was very popular on the web. The later in the second half of the year, I added other web apps with data that help people understand, because we went from the insurance companies, that was the front line, it's like an onion, you peel it back, to the reinsurance companies, to the computer modeling companies that peg the risk of disaster. And we kept finding fraud after fraud in each one of these layers, and each layer then kind of had its own app. This app takes a look at the risk of actual hurricane loss as predicted by a black box computer model that consumers other than this app don't have access to, and shows that this is a house in Miami, $250,000 house. You could plug in where you live, what kind of house you have, how much it's worth, and it would kick back to you the amount of average hurricane losses. 3,400 sounds like a lot, average annual loss for a home in Miami, but when you're paying $10,000 a year to insure that house, you understand that you're being overcharged, and that's the, this really fueled the outrage factor, let people really get their gall up and help the project have tremendous force, and later when the legislature reconvened or even in elections and stuff, we're seeing this stuff come up. We have some of these apps take a little bit more. Here's another one that shows what's happening to the insurance market in the state in terms of where companies are leaving and where companies are coming, and that was the specific to a single county. In fact, let me click on this for a second and see what happens. Yeah, so you get the secret information of who's actually writing insurance in your county and who is leaving. And it is literally secret until a lot of this stuff, till we put it up, regulators wouldn't even tell the public. And then my favorite out of the secret documents, Trove, we just put up more recently. Just a couple of months ago, we got access to confidential records that show how well insurance companies in the state are actually prepared to pay for a hurricane, and who is and who isn't. It's kind of like Warren Buffett says, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. And so here we go. We take away the tide. And let me click. Allstate, in order to avoid the bad reputation of what it was doing in Florida, changed its name in Florida to Castle Key. So here's Allstate. And this shows, I've essentially done another kind of tried to make it accessible to readers rather than being technical in terms of figures and data, but essentially shows that the company does not have money to pay for a 100-year storm. And so the good hands people, and wait, that's State Farm. I can't remember Allstate's motto. Anyway.
Terrific, thank you. Your questions first. Questions for Paige. Yes, please.
So you got information interviews from it seemed like a bunch of sort of industry insiders, and it seemed like in a number of them you're sort of dealing with people who may have kind of had their own interests, like the woman who's working for the modeling company or the people from the Association of Insurance Agents. Like, how did you? I mean, it seemed like these people were a lot more scrupulous than some of the folks that you were dealing with, but how did you decide sort of what information you got from these people you could use and what you couldn't?
This is a trick I learned in covering politics, is that everybody likes to shoot the other guy. So, and everybody had a vested interest on their own corner of their world, and so I knew everything that they said about themselves was probably a lie or false or slanted in some way. But the stuff that they would give me on the other guys was usually very good. And of course, I checked it all out. Everything is backed, and I don't do this kind of reporting based on what someone says. There's got to be documents and there's got to be data. You need the proof. But in this case, we had 4 different industries or layers of industries, and they all kept shooting each other and just giving me, I had reinsurers saying, well, you wouldn't believe what I can tell you about these virtual companies. So, yeah.
Next question.
My name's Sabrina. I'm also in the Stabile program. And one of the things that struck me most about this piece is where the Office of Insurance Regulation sort of stands in responsibility for this entire disaster. So I'm curious as to who regulates or who monitors the OIR, and what pressure from above did they feel to sort of keep companies like Keystone alive versus maintaining, the legacy companies. For example, can the state of Florida take action against them, or have they already?
Yeah, there's a tremendous hesitancy by regulators in the state to publicly regulate or to even publicly warn people that the situation's, at a tipping point or near crisis. The insurance commissioner is essentially appointed position by the cabinet. The cabinet is the governor and two other elected officials, who all of whom at the moment are Republican. And there's a don't rock the boat mentality, because that would be admitting failure. And politicians are averse to doing that on their own watch. They'll likely blame the prior administration, in a heartbeat. But heaven forbid, take ownership to a nightmare that they helped create. And in this case, we saw where they set up the companies that collapsed, spectacularly. So they could be counted on not to, say mea culpa and I'm sorry or anything like that. We had the insurance commissioner literally run away from me one day, and try to escape through a parking garage.
I can understand that. Next question.
Hi, my name is Jeff Green, also a Stabile student. What I was most fascinated about your exploration into this world of reinsurance. I had no idea about this before. I'm an insurance dummy. And
I didn't know they existed either.
I just found that fascinating, and it's also very secretive and very much privately owned and operated. And you discovered a lot about it. It seems that there is a lot more still that is unknown, because they are private companies. Even 6 of these companies that failed, you didn't, or I think it was 6. You weren't able to find a lot about, because there wasn't a lot in the public record. Do you feel that there's more to be done about this? Regarding this reinsurance industry and some of the private companies, private startups?
Oh, heavens, yes. I mean, as Walt said, it's a field of low-hanging fruit, because few people want to look at insurance. Few reporters want to, do that to their social reputation. And there is so much money to be had, and so much more money to be had if you tilt the game. So yes, and there is a limit, unfortunately, in what we could do as a small community paper to cover an international industry. But if you want to, email me afterward, and I'll give you some tips.
I can say my favorite part is where you described the Monte Carlo getaway, and how they have one scheduled event about some obscure part about the business.
And the thing I forgot to put in the story is only 10 people came. There are literally 1,000 people in Monte Carlo having champagne parties and doing their little Monaco yacht race and all of the events and things that they have. But the official meeting, there's about 10 people in the room. The guy's speaking French. There's no translators. But that's how the business is done. In fact, they used to create contracts, multi-million-dollar contracts on cocktail napkins in Monte Carlo. It's now since become more sophisticated.
Sounds like Bell, California.
And it is, and that is the truth. See, and the shipping, industry, it's greed. And it's fear, and it's power, and it's the same human elements over and over again. And people will do what people will do,
Next question.
Hi, Esme DePrez. I graduated from here a couple years ago. Now I'm at Bloomberg and Business Week. Just wondering, on the ground level, how you organize all your information. You said 3 years. Just really basic stuff. How do you keep track of your contacts? Do you transcribe everything just in case you might go back to it?
Mm-hmm.
Just what are your ground rules for keeping it all together?
Yeah, I'm very anal. So I do transcribe everything, and then I create Excel spreadsheets on everything, and I create timelines. Amy mentioned the timeline, the 3-dimensional timelines, and they are so important too. And then I put everything in files. Bartlett and Steele do this, I found out from their editor too. When they're conceiving a book, they immediately start thinking what chapter, what story, and as their notes are developed, things get copied in multiple and put into this folder and that folder. So you begin organizing along some kind of structure that you've envisioned in your head from day one. And I do that with the hard drives and the subfolders beneath them too. I try to create so that I can find things later, because.
Do you keep hard copies, or do you just do it electronically?
Both, and after I had a technician wipe my laptop clean, I keep a backup hard drive and then a backup of that.
Last
So,
question.
well, and we live in a state with hurricanes, so I imagine that the newsroom will be flooded, and I will lose everything, so I have something in the cloud, too. Last question. Yeah.
Sean Easter, current student. You have preemptively answered every question I could come up with about the repertorial process of this story. So I'm left being the ugly guy among investigative journalists and asking you about, first, sort of the business impact of this, like how much resources your paper had to devote to this over 3 years, whether it could sustain it again, and how other papers have reacted to this investigation. Has anyone in Florida jumped onto the insurance beat because they see how
Don't I wish?
Wilford it is?
No, well, small newsroom, people were being laid off. The guy who recruited me to the paper was laid off within a couple months of, and sat next to me. Now there's an empty desk next to me. So I know the resources devoted to it were painful for the paper, but it was largely just one reporter. I think it paid off. We have an amazing readership in Sarasota, and an incredibly intelligent and articulate and diverse readership, and dedicated, and they love the paper, and so they love stories like this. So, so I think it was well worth it for the paper. I'm a bit disappointed with some of the other journalists in the state. We had not every other. In fact, one of the weakest supporting editorials was our own editorial board, but we had every editorial board in the state write editorials praising this project and calling for action, and we had a lot of, legislature did a couple of things, regulators fined some people and promised to crack down on the rules, but more importantly, people got motivated, and we have community activist groups statewide now that are, coalescing on the insurance issue and property insurance, because the crisis is continuing. Another year without hurricanes, another $4 billion in premium out the door. Where did it go? It didn't, build up the safety net in the state. When we do get our storm, sooner or later, it will happen. We're going to have companies failing like flies, but the other reporters in the state still continue to just do the he said, she said, and don't even get out a simple Excel sheet and add up the numbers and say, well, wait a minute, where did the money go? So.
And so begins the turkey shoot phase of our evening. We're all up here, take shots at us, ask us questions. Please.
Hi, my name is Shira Vicker-Fox. I'm a 1998 graduate of the school, and now I freelance in suburban New Jersey. And I guess my question is for the LA Times reporters. Sometimes I begrudgingly cover town council meetings, and while no one really likes it, I feel like they can be exciting for the nuggets the gems that might be there. So I wanted to hear from you, how do I get past the jargon and the procedure, and what are the red flags for items that are not necessarily on the agenda or being discussed at the meeting?
Well, I would say for jargon, it's up to you to learn the jargon, to be able to translate the jargon to your readers, and you should be able to develop sources in the government. I mean, a question, well, first of all, there's no such thing as a stupid question, which I hope all you guys have already learned. And go up to someone and say, listen, I don't understand this. Can you please explain it to me? I think all of us have probably done that. Are you talking about stuff that's not on the agenda, or, well...
The behind the scenes, the real stories. They present one side to the public, and what kind of, when does the light bulb go off and you're like, oh, I think there's more to this, or I need to find out about this?
Well, I think they're oftentimes are gadflies, people who are looking around at that stuff, and sometimes I find, and I think you have too, you'll be covering something that it just doesn't feel right, and I think you have to follow those kinds of instincts.
Yeah, I mean, for me it was, when I was in I'll give you an example I was in Maywood, and I had this gut feeling that something was weird about this whole thing with between the city of Maywood and the city of Bell, and they were already sort of kind of contacting each other, and I thought there must be a conflict of interest there, and I looked into it, it didn't really pan out, but then it's something in me that just kept me wanting to, so I asked around, talked to the gadflies, and they're like, no, they really just want to get rid of this police department, and they were trying to merge in, and, we're hearing about high salaries over there, and at some point, Maywood had brought in the assistant city manager from Bell to handle contracts for Maywood, and which I thought that again was like, this is weird. This is an administrator from another city coming in to handle another city's business that essentially is going to contract with the city that she's from. I mean, God, this is like, it's really like, obviously something is going on here. So what is the story? And and they were having press conferences almost every other week saying, oh, we're just trying to help our neighbor. Maywood is sinking. Would you let your neighbor's house burn if you saw it? And I'd be like, well, first of all, it's not a house. I mean, this is a city, and I don't buy this like I'm trying to help my neighbor. Nothing is for free. There's always a catch. There's always a hook. So what is it? And they were all just, constantly evading the question. And so that's what made me want to pursue it more and more. When you don't feel like you're getting the full answer until you follow it through. And I think ultimately really is developing sources. Paige sort of mentioned something about how she didn't know, and so she would talk to her source to sort of point her in the direction of where she would get certain documents. We learned that in our investigation, you talk to sources. Where can I get this? Who can give it to me on the record? Or, you're trying to build a proof. You don't want to just go with what he said, she said. So essentially, that's what we did, really. You just that's the thing about being a reporter. You've got to be sociable, talk to people, get their numbers, talk to them, check in with them, bug them when they're, when even you're not working on a story, just call them, hey, how's it going? So what's going on over there? And, just joke around with them, be human, and eventually they come to you and they'll start telling you stuff that wow, okay, then I got to look into this. And developing sources, it really is just, it'll come with as you're out there and talking to people.
Thank you.
Nancy,
Hi. I have a small...
can you speak into the microphone and pull it down?
I'm too short. Here we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi. I have a very, very small foundation, and I want the Bell team to know first that you inspired me to give a grant to the J School directed to Sheila Cornell to assist budding investigative journalists. I want to congratulate you before I ask my question on hitting the trifecta. You uncovered corruption, you got the Pulitzer, and you got indictments. People walked away in handcuffs, which is Walt has suggested and our other panelists have said sometimes doesn't happen. But my question is, another person questioning you alluded to cutbacks with respect to local coverage. Has the LA Times been encouraged to increase local coverage because of the success of your series of articles?
Well, first of all, the staff is half the size it was when I started 14 years ago. And we've had layoffs as, recently as a couple months ago. So the layoffs continue, unfortunately, and we're still in bankruptcy. But one of the things I think has happened that the Bell stuff has done, in a sense, it's sort of focused the paper a lot more on municipal corruption. The city next door, Vernon, which is a very different city than Bell, only 92 people live there. But it's a huge, all these businesses are there. We've done lots of great reporting, not us, other reporters have done some great reporting about the corruption going on there. What else? I think we've done a lot. Montebello, which is another city which is having real problems. So I think the Bell stuff has, in a sense, focused some of our resources toward that kind of reporting.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Zainab from NYU's journalism program, and my question is directed to Paige. You've done so much, and there's still so much more to be done with the stories that you've covered, and it's typically the case in any investigation story. So my question is basically, during the investigation process, how do you stick to your narrative that you got in and not get distracted by the other bigger stories that keep coming up?
It's a good question.
Yeah, keeping focused was hard, especially because I was once a wire service reporter where you were beating the other wire service by seconds. And so I still have that impulse to, like, the moment I know something, get it into print. So I actually would constantly propose stories as dailies to peel off this project, or I was scared to death a competitor might come along and take it away from me too. And I was held back by my editors in this case. A wonderful executive editor at the paper who just would look at me with this blank stare and say, just keep digging, and send me back into my project. And you know, until I was, you know, exhausted and couldn't do it anymore, and then pulled me back up to daylight and say, let's get into print.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Jackie. I'm a 2009 graduate, and I wanted to ask, I'm sure many of you have experienced being stonewalled by people that you consider critical to the story, very important sources. At what point do you decide to move your focus to finding other people who are also critical, or versus continuing to be persistent and pounding them with questions when it's a stone wall, basically?
I'm going, ooh, can I take this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because this was one of the great moments for me on this project. It was the CEO of the biggest reinsurance company in Bermuda that handles most of the risk in Florida, and he was absolutely critical. And I got other people. I got the former CEO. I got some people to speak off the record with the company, but it wasn't going to do it unless I got to the guy. And he's the CEO of a foreign corporation. So his publicist in New York said, he's never going to talk to you. What's more, he requests that you not mention the name of his company, which couldn't have motivated me more. And it's like the moment of trying to get the documents from Bell. You know, when people tell you to go to wait, that's when you go, yes, I'm coming at you. So I parachuted into Bermuda. I tried to ambush him at a conference. He left the room 10 minutes before I got there. So then I wound up in Monte Carlo, and I basically hacked his private email account, by not the account, but I mean the address. You know, you look at the patterns of how the company does their private email addresses, and you recognize a pattern. Oh, so if I use his first name and his last name and a number, then I'm going to send him a private email. And I did in Monte Carlo, and I said, I'm here, I want to talk to you. And he said, okay, I'll come out, and I'll meet you on the steps of the Hotel de Paris, right outside of the casino. And there he was, and then ding, my email came up, and it was the publicist saying, he will never talk to you, because he didn't know the guy was standing right there with me at that moment. So you never give up, you never go away, you just start getting creative. I'm sure you've got great versions of the same thing.
Yes, next question over here. Unless you want to chime in?
That's fine.
My name is Erin Ritchie. I'm another Stabile student. This is sort of a general question, although it does speak to something that Amy brought up, is the fact that a lot of times there are people involved in the investigation who know that something is wrong and they're concerned, but they are powerless to do anything about it. So in Amy's case, they were people who suspected that it was sort of a hit and run at sea, as opposed to they were concerned and they wanted to do something about it, but they didn't have the resources or they didn't have the voice. So what role did that play in each of your investigations?
Well, for me, huge. When you realize that there's only one group looking into something, and it's the Coast Guard, and you're already a little bit suspicious because it took the Coast Guard 2 months to inspect and interview the crew of the ship that was closest to the Lady Mary when she sank. You know, and I got a lot of encouragement from other people in the business, especially other commercial fishermen. You know, yes, finally someone is going to look at this. This happens, you know, we have near misses all the time, or I know somebody, you know, whose ship was, collided with a container ship. And in fact, you know, there were two incidents of collisions with fishing vessels while I was doing the research on this story. So, and they were, back in the newspaper stories, and one of them was in New York. So it felt very important because also the people that are involved, commercial fishermen, live a hand-to-mouth existence. They're very poor. It's an industry that also, fishermen, there are a lot of drug and alcohol problems. There's a whole other story there. So it was a very powerful impulse.
Last question.
No, go ahead. No, we can move on.
No, go ahead.
There's always that person that is afraid to talk, and I think as a reporter, it's up to you to sort of, help them build that relationship, that trust with them, and let them know that you're there to obviously report on something that clearly no one else is reporting, like Amy said. At one point we faced issues when we were doing the Bell thing. We faced issues getting public records, and at some point, a person whose name still has yet to be, released publicly, had access to all these documents and was going to provide it to us. And it took a lot of convincing to have this person sort of hand over these documents. So it essentially would allow us to start really digging into and see what we wanted to look at in this town. And this person was afraid. I don't want to get caught. I don't want to be involved. And again, part of it is just trying to convince them you're there to do what other people. It's going to be a while until someone else comes along and asks you. Do you want me to? I'm trying to figure out what's wrong here. Help me. And that person will be eventually to come forward. So building that trust is essential.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I'm also a Stabile and newspaper student. I worked at a small to mid-sized daily for 4 years, and one of the reasons I left to come here was to come to the investigative journalism program because I was so frustrated with kind of the lack of training or support that I had to do anything other than to feed the beast and to do the 2, 3, 4 stories a day. And so I was wondering, have any of you collaborated with any of these smaller papers, thought of maybe doing trainings? Because it wasn't necessarily that I don't think my editors didn't want me looking into those things. It was a question of, letting me go off and investigate, foster care abuses, which were happening all over Massachusetts, or do the 2 to 3 stories a day because we were at a limited staff as well. So, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that would really help? Because, these local papers, we know the people on the streets better than anyone, so I wanted to know your thoughts on that, about kind of bigger papers collaborating more with smaller in terms of trainings and so forth.
If they don't have thoughts on it, I do. A lot of the old models are being thrown out the window. I think it's up to each individual to figure out the best way to do an investigation. And I think you're going to find editors more receptive to different approaches. And certainly Sheila knows a lot about the nonprofits that are getting together and pairing up with papers. So why not? Why not propose that? Why not take it upon yourself to try and forge a relationship and go to your editor and say, yes, I've spoken to a larger paper and it's in both of our interests. Who knows what the answer will be? That's my take on it.
Absolutely, because there are no boundaries anymore, between what you can do, whether you're small paper or large, especially with the resources cut at large papers.
Yeah, but I think you've hit on something that can be a real frustration when you're working at a small paper, is that, go to city council meeting and crank out your 2 or 3 stories. I would suggest what you try to do is bite off a small piece of that bigger story and then, gradually work on it and try to, develop string on it till you can finally turn to your editor and say, listen, here's what I've got, give me, not 3 years like Paige did, or we
never ask for 3 years up front. That's a bad idea.
I only asked for 3 months.
Right. Even give me a week, I can give you this. And bite off that.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Ted Ruhensha. I'm in the digital media program. Jeff and Ruben actually mentioned that there was only a flood of reaction when the news story came out on print. Could you just please discuss or say something about the value of adding online component to your stories?
It was interesting. We added a lot of the multimedia on this story was great. We added. We were sort of essentially teaching the readers something about municipal government. How did these salaries break down? And we created a special website for that, and so readers could sort of add up the figures like we were while we were reporting. We had. Something that we didn't have before either was the salaries of, we didn't know how to compare salaries with right? I mean, I'm trying to remember the police chief, for instance, he made $457,000. We wanted to compare him with other police chiefs, and we had to call around, and that wasn't available. But it helped us put that together again online with charts and other stuff.
Yeah, it was very effective. And we recently won an award from the Online News Association for the Bell stuff, which is something which I think the two of us can take very little credit for, because we had, things were going so quickly when we were doing this story that we would have other people who are on our online side who building stuff on the web. And I do think it was very effective. They built, besides posting the stories, a variety of databases involving official salaries, and people could compare them. So, the more you can give the readers, like Paige showed, the better it is. People are interested, they go to the website, they can look at the stories, they can do sorting of their own. I mean, the online stuff can be very effective.
And we were also using, which is, more people should get into the habit of using this. We were using document clouds. We were uploading documents that we got through public records, scanning them, uploading them. And so if we were talking about a contract, we would put it out there. We would make notes, and so that you, the reader, could, if you're online and you're reading the story, there's a copy of the contract, and so you read it, and here's what we noticed when we were looking at these contracts. And I mean, I don't think I had the time to go back and check comments to see if anyone spotted something that we didn't spot. But essentially, you're adding more to the story than what than the reporting that's being done. You're putting the stuff out there, and people are interested in this, and they want to be involved as well. And so it adds more. And it makes people stay on your website longer because they're out, fiddling around with the stuff that you're putting on. So video, I went out and I got reaction of residents, and I, with a little flip camera, which I, would like to now carry around more often to capture reaction. And, you could quickly turn a blog post item from, just a blog post to a blog post with a video, and then heck, if you even have the document, you include that in there, and boom, you got yourself this little short snippet with so much information all tucked into this one thing. So,
thank you. I want to thank Sheila Cornell for doing the terrific visuals that we had tonight, and to Walt Bogdanich for his masterly job of moderating the panel. But above all, I want to thank our panelists, because I think they did demonstrate that there are great stories out there hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment for reporters to start asking the right questions. And I think they also demonstrated that despite the economic hard times that we in the media face, that as far as Pulitzer Prizes are concerned, the watchdog journalist does still bark, and the watchdog journalist does still bite.
Yes.
Thank you.